Picture this. You use the chaos of a collapsing empire to literally buy a presidency, only to end up completely broke and dead in a foreign country. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're decoding the wild rise and fall of one of history's most powerful billionaires, a guy known as the Godfather of the Kremlin. We are talking about a story of unimaginable wealth, ruthless ambition, and ultimately, absolute ruin.
So how in the world do you go from being a quiet, academically minded mathematician to holding the keys to the Russian government, only to lose every single penny in the largest civil lawsuit in recorded history? Well, it all started in a time of unprecedented chaos. We're going to see exactly how a gifted outsider played a crumbling system to grab absolute power, right before it all collapsed on top of him.
Section 1. The Wild East. To really wrap our heads around how someone could seize so much power so incredibly fast, we actually have to rewind to 1991. That's when Russia abruptly slammed the brakes on communism and shifted to a free market capitalist system.
This abrupt switch meant deregulating prices and opening up the country to imports. But thanks to a toxic mix of corruption and sheer incompetence, the transition was a complete disaster. The currency absolutely tanked, industrial output was cut in half, and unemployment doubled basically overnight. For everyday folks, it was an absolute nightmare. But for a few ruthless opportunists, it was the ultimate playground.
Enter our protagonist, a brilliant mathematician named Boris Berezovsky. He actually built his first fortune by exploiting a ridiculously simple inflation loophole. See, he would buy huge shipments of cars on consignment, but he'd delay paying the producers for months. Because the Russian currency was an absolute freefall, by the time he finally paid his bill, the money was worth dramatically less. It's kind of like buying a car today for 10 grand, but waiting to pay until inflation makes that cash worth only 5,000. You keep the car, pocket the difference, and boom. That simple loophole built his initial empire.
But then, everything changed in 1994. Boris was riding in his Mercedes when a massive explosion ripped right through the car. Miraculously, he survived the flames and the broken glass, though tragically, his driver was killed. This was a highly targeted assassination attempt, something that was shockingly common for businessmen back then. But surviving it gave Boris a terrifying wake-up call. He realized that having immense wealth meant absolutely nothing without political power to back it up. He needed the kind of protection money couldn't buy. He needed to control the government itself.
Section 2. Buying a President. Let's look at how that terrifying realization turned into a totally audacious plan to just literally buy a government.
So President Boris Yeltsin was facing an upcoming election, and his odds were incredibly slim. Most of the country was stuck in poverty, and they blamed him for it. Knowing this, Boris assembled a small squad of ultra-wealthy businessmen known as the Seven Bankers. Behind closed doors, they hammered out a massive deal. They agreed to pump millions into Yeltsin's failing campaign, and in exchange, they wanted totally unregulated influence over Russia's privatization. Flooded with their cash and completely backed by their media networks, Yeltsin narrowly squeaked out a win. And get this, as their reward, Russia's most valuable state-owned assets were sold off to these bankers at heavily rigged auctions. We're talking about oligarchs buying up prime oil companies for just $120 million, when their actual market value was closer to $13 billion. To put that into perspective, that would be like buying a massive American tech giant for the price of a local grocery store. It was quite literally the absolute peak of crony capitalism.
This tiny little group ended up owning Russia's most vital industries: banking, oil, gas, mining, you name it. Boris himself was handed control of Russia's largest television channel, ORT. He essentially turned it into a giant propaganda machine to keep the government compliant. Wielding nearly half of all the wealth in the entire country, they were totally unregulated. They were, for all intents and purposes, untouchable oligarchs.
Section 3. The Ultimate Oil Deal. With unchecked political power totally secured, Boris figured out a way to monetize it without ever having to run a real business.
During a meeting out on a yacht, Boris crossed paths with a young, super-ambitious entrepreneur named Roman Abramovich. Roman wanted to merge some state oil assets into a massive monopoly called Sibneft, but he knew the government would never allow it. He needed Boris's influence inside Yeltsin's inner circle to cut through the red tape, so they made a quiet, unwritten deal. Boris handled the politics, and in return, regular suitcases stuffed with millions of dollars in cash were delivered directly to him. Boris did zero operational work. He was just a highly paid political shield.
Section 4. The Putin Ultimatum.
This cozy arrangement worked beautifully right up until 1999. The oligarchs were terrified of a communist comeback that would strip away all their wealth, so they needed a strong successor to replace an ailing Yeltsin.
The man they picked was a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. Boris and his billionaire friends used their media empires and massive wealth to get him elected, genuinely thinking they could pull his strings just like they did with Yeltsin. But the second Putin took power, he flipped the script. On live television, he made a totally chilling declaration. These oligarchs would cease to exist as a class.
Now, in private, Putin laid out a very simple ultimatum. He essentially said, pay a form of tribute, stay completely out of politics, stay out of my way, and you can keep your billions. Roman Abramovich and several others quietly took the deal. But Boris, he proudly refused. He actually believed he was the one who put Putin in power, so he used his TV channel to launch this relentless anti-Putin media campaign.
But with Putin, Boris had finally met his match. The government hit back hard and fast. Boris was convicted of embezzlement, and the state seized his beloved television network, completely neutralizing his main weapon. By 2002, staring down an arrest warrant for money laundering and illegal business practices, Boris was forced to flee Russia entirely and go into permanent exile in London.
Section 5. The billion-dollar downfall. Now, you might think escaping with your life is a win, but for Boris, exile was literally just the beginning of his absolute destruction.
Once he was stuck in London, Boris was politically useless back in Russia. Roman Abramovich gave him one final payout and permanently cut off those secret suitcases of cash. But the thing is, Boris kept living like an untouchable billionaire. He was dropping huge money on an army of private bodyguards to prevent being assassinated, and then a historically massive divorce settlement just completely gutted his remaining assets. His immense fortune was vanishing at a terrifying speed. Desperate for cash and trying to stay relevant, Boris took a massive gamble. He sued his former protege, Roman Abramovich, in the UK courts. This ended up sparking the largest civil lawsuit in recorded history. Boris claimed they had a 50-50 partnership in the oil company and that he'd been extorted into selling his stake for pennies on the dollar. Roman's defense? Brutally simple. He stated Boris never actually owned a single share and that no legal paperwork existed because those cash payments were purely for political protection. This wild, 9-month trial dragged the dark, bloody reality of Russian crony capitalism out for the whole world to see.
Boris bet his entire reputation on this showdown, and man, did it backfire spectacularly. After listening to all the grim details of political bribery and rigged auctions, the presiding judge delivered a totally devastating verdict against him. She stated, and I quote, "I found Mr. Berezovsky an unimpressive and inherently unreliable witness who would have said almost anything to support his case."
He didn't just lose his bid for billions. He was ordered to pay Roman's exorbitant legal fees, which totaled over $50 million. That financial blow was the final nail in the coffin. He went from wielding immense political power and having unbelievable wealth to being completely, utterly ruined. Not long after the trial, at age 67, Boris Berezovsky was found dead in his apartment in an apparent suicide.
So, to wrap up this explainer, it's easy for us to comfortably use the term oligarchs when we talk about wealthy elites buying influence and pulling government strings in Russia. But we really have to ask ourselves, is this dangerous intersection of extreme wealth and political manipulation truly unique to just one country? Or is that hidden connection between massive money and political power a reality everywhere, and we just choose to call it by different names depending on where we live?